Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And we're going to cover your listener questions for this month, July 2024. Justin, summer is in full swing. It is getting hot here in Colorado. I'm sure the rest of the country is in that boat as well. Justin, let's just go ahead and dive into this first question. I think we have a really interesting mix. A lot of questions related to non-operated working interests, like you mentioned before we hit record, which is good. And there's some nuances we'll talk about that we don't normally cover.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, working interest is a beast in and of its own, and it's interesting to see these questions come in. So the first one here is from Ben. Ben says, my mother recently passed away, and he learned her estate includes a working interest in an oil well purchased in 1967. All he could tell is that she's been paying a monthly operator's expense for a long time, and he's looking for a way to try to value it in order to sell it. And Matt, like we mentioned, working interest is kind of a beast in its own, and so in this situation, it sounds like they've been paying an expense, which makes sense since the price of gas and oil is lower than it has been in the past. This may have been a case where she was making money at one time, but those tables have turned at this point.
Yeah, at this point, it's probably a marginal well, what they call sometimes a stripper well. In other words, it's making like a barrel or so per day or less. So that situation, there's a certain amount of fixed costs and then also some variable costs in terms of fuel and electricity to run the pump jack and chemical treatments and a pumper to go out there and check on things. There are operating expenses that go into operating these wells. And at some point when the production gets so low, they're making less in revenue than it costs to operate that well. And in some cases, that will trigger the operator to go and plug and abandon the well. In some cases, they may want to drill some additional wells on that lease in the future. So they just nurse it along at a loss. Something from a working interest owner, it's kind of a catch-22, right? You want to be making money. You don't want to have to be writing a check every month, but you also want to maintain the possibility of the upside if they go and drill a well in the future. In this case, Ben had sent some additional information and he was really looking for, a way to value the property. So he had said, I just have the well management company willing to purchase it for a small amount, but I'm curious if it's worth more. So we kind of went back and forth via email, and I took a look at where the interests were located. And it didn't appear there wasn't any activity nearby in terms of new wells being permitted or drilled. From that standpoint, I told him it would be hard to value any upside potential in those deeper or undeveloped acreage. So when we look at running valuations or appraisals on property, there are different reserves categories. In other words, different likelihood, basically value associated with the oil and gas that's under the ground. In this case, because it's an older conventional well, a lot of the value we see from our minerals and royalties today is from these horizontal wells that are being drilled in these shale formations. And they're very large, high producing wells. Absent of that, oftentimes you really can't put much value onto the potential of an additional vertical well being drilled because those are more hit or miss, those conventional type wells. In this case, this was in Crockett County, Texas, and we were looking at, okay, what's a possible development scenario, and looking at the county and kind of north of where these interests were, there were some horizontal wells that were drilled about 10 years ago. Those produced mostly gas and they didn't really drill anymore. So my presumption there was it wasn't economic to continue drilling. And with the amount of associated gas coming out of the Permian Basin right now, we see the Waha hub, that's like the local hub for natural gas, and we're seeing negative gas prices, in fact. And so this means that if you have primarily a formation that's going to produce gas, operators aren't going to go and drill in there anytime soon because of that oversupply of gas in that area and low prices. It's just not economic to drill. And so that was kind of the gist of our conversation via email when I responded to Ben. And then the other thing that was a little bit of a bummer was that in that portion of the Midland Basin, the wells that have been drilled into like the Wolfcamp Formation in northern Crockett County really underperform some of the other Midland Basin areas like Reagan County or Upton County. And so from that standpoint, what we looked at is, okay, you could hire me to do a valuation, but it's probably going to cost you more to value the asset than it's worth. And so maybe the best bet is to negotiate with the operator that he's already got a positive purchase offer from, and probably the best option. And so a lot of cases when you have non-operated working interests that are in these no real line of sight to future development, maybe not worth a ton. In that case, if you want to divest it, you can get rid of that liability. If they do eventually plug and abandon the well, you would be on the hook for paying the share of the expense of that. And so sometimes it's a good way to just get some positive economic value out of it and wash your hands of it and eliminate that future liability. Again, there's a risk that they do go in and drill those horizontal wells, and you would have had the opportunity to participate, keeping in mind that you would have had to pay your proportional share of the cost of drilling and completing any future wells. So if you had a well that was going to be drilled for a total of $9 million, in this case, it was around a 4% working interest, you'd have to spend $360,000 per well to participate in that and then get your proportional share of the working interest on those new wells. And so sometimes that can be a pretty big financial burden, Justin, for people. And it's maybe better just to try to sell it. And if you were in that situation, let's say where there were permits, you have a tremendous amount of bargaining power because there is a big demand for wellbore AFEs or AFEs in these types of participation situations, working interest situations, because people can get tremendous tax benefits from it. And so there are people that maybe have sold another property recently. They want to get some tax benefits. Investing into oil and gas wells from a non-operated working interest perspective can be a good tax strategy. Again, talk to your CPA. This shouldn't be construed as tax advice, but lots of options there, Justin, if you do have wells that are permitted or if you're in a really hot area. But in some cases, there may be nothing going on, and maybe it's better just to sell it while there's a little bit of value there.
You said it, Matt. And working interest is, like you said, it's not really an uncommon thing. And Matt, there were a couple things in your response to Ben here that I thought were really interesting. One of them being that you mentioned an option you would have would be to sell it to that person who's managing the wells and then potentially keep an overriding royalty interest in the process of that sale, of course, provided that the buyer is interested in that. And that is an option with these working interests. It's a way to keep some interest in that well, but get rid of the cost-bearing side. So I thought that was a great mention. We're very clear with him that it's very possible that the value would be low or potentially negative, and kind of laid out the cost to do an evaluation. That way he can make a decision. But Matt, I'm sure that's a scenario you run into a lot when the value is just not worth even the fee required to come up with a certified value for that property.
Yeah, and particularly as you get interests that are smaller and smaller, and they only make maybe a $50 a month or a couple $100 a month, and it starts to become a decision: how much money do you want to spend managing that asset, or time do you want to spend it managing that, or just cash the checks and call it good? So yeah, it's a challenge for sure. So, well, do you want to talk about this next question here?
Let's do it. So the next one's from Mark here, and he gives us a bit of background on the email. Says that his brother and himself inherited his dad's oil and gas investment business when he passed away in 2021. He's been working to get a handle on it ever since. He mentioned that he went through Matt's Mineral Management Basics course, which is wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And that he wish you would have had it whenever you got started down this road. And he kind of goes on to tell a little bit more, and he has a couple questions. So he has a working interest in an older well that is nearing the end of its life and is producing less than 10 barrels a month. Production is so low that the operator hasn't made a revenue payment in over a year. So all they have are the expenses, which is about $80 a month. And it's been going on and has for years, he says. He knows somebody who works for the operator and asked about plans for the well and was told that they have no plans for the next quarter. Is it safe to assume that the operator has everyone's best interest in mind and is using the well to hold a lease until they can do further development nearby? Or is he in danger of a washout situation? If they assign the well back to the operator, could they turn around and develop the lease in the near future and we'd miss out on any revenue from that? And Matt, this is really a wonderful question and kind of shows Mark's understanding of mineral rights, but a great thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things that we cover in a lot more detail in episode 228 in terms of what you should know about lease washouts. And so he mentions that episode in there and that he had a light bulb moment about this with respect to his particular situation. So yeah, he's definitely getting into the details. You can tell really understanding the nuances of these types of interests. And it's a really good question to ask because It is something from a non-operated working interest perspective. Again, on these older wells, it is possible that the operator could wash out your interest, but again, there's a financial incentive for them not to in general, especially if this is an older lease, because back, say, 50 years ago, the going royalty rate was 1/8. And so that's a 12.5% royalty. And so that means that their net revenue interest in that lease is quite a bit higher than what they could get today. And especially if it's in a hot area, a going rate for the royalty for a new oil and gas lease could be 20 to 25%. And so that means they would only get 75 to 80% of the revenue from that, because then they would have that royalty burden on that 20 to 25% side. Versus the existing lease, if they're only paying 12.5%, that means they keep 87.5% of the revenue in that scenario. So even if you have a small non-operated working interest that is diluting their portion of it, so to speak, they're probably in a better financial situation just trying to hold the lease by production, and that's probably why they're just nursing it along, like you mentioned, Mark. So it's something where they're probably just waiting until they're ready to drill another well. Again, this is just assuming there's horizontal drilling occurring nearby and that this acreage just hasn't been developed yet in those deeper formations. So the way you'd really figure that out is going to the State Oil and Gas Commission website, looking at your legal description of that lease, figuring out what activity is going on. Is there the likelihood? Is this operator drilling other wells in the area? And if you can, again, talk to your friend that works in that company, just to try to find a little bit more information if possible, or just look at publicly available information to see is it likely that they're going to drill new wells. If that's the case, again, just like we mentioned in that last question, there would be value there to market your interest to try to sell them if you wanted to do that. Again, the highest value you would see for that is when there's line of sight to drilling. So, for example, they've permitted new wells, you have AFEs in hand, you could go to market and try to go and post it on EnergyNet or something like that, or go to a broker and they'd help you sell it for top dollar. And then you could potentially retain an overriding royalty. Again, back to the discussion that Justin mentioned earlier. In that case, especially if there's a lot of demand for that property, you can negotiate with the buyer to come up with the creative solution. Maybe they carry part of your interest in exchange for earning some of it, or you could, again, sell the non-operated working interest, retainer override, so you don't have the cost element, but then you get to have some exposure to the future upside. So certainly some options there, but again, just do your due diligence. Again, going through that mineral management basics course. In the course, I talk about how to do that, how to find your lease or your wells on the State Oil and Gas Commission website and find out what kind of activity is going on nearby to see what the potential might be. So good luck.
Yeah, good luck, Mark, and great catching that in that you might be in that circumstance. So our next one here is from Jennie. Jennie says, hi, I can see production for our wells on the Oklahoma Tax Commission site. It only goes back 1 year. She called OCC and they said the tax commission has the previous records, I assume for previous years. Neither one seemed to have the correct answer. And she's asking if maybe we know by chance how to find that information.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennie. And technically, I think the OTC, the Oklahoma Tax Commission, keeps the official record of production for the state of Oklahoma. To your point, it does seem like they only have the last year's data available. In the past, you used to be able to go to the OCC and see all of the years of production. Something broke, I think, on the OCC website when they did their upgrade of their website and their new GIS browser and stuff. Because when you go to the different wells, and you try to click on production data, it shows no records available, even though those wells are producing. And so I was able to go through and double check that that's still the case. And it does seem like the OCC website doesn't appear to be reporting production. At least maybe there's a pop-up block. I have some issue with my browser or something. That could be another issue. But from my standpoint, it didn't look like I could obtain production data from the OCC website. I use a product called Well Database. They actually have a free plan, a light plan, I think is what it's called, LITE. And so if you go to welldatabase.com, you can look at their plans, and at the very bottom, you'll see a link for the free plan. And you can view production data for all states, including Oklahoma, on Well Database. So that might be another way to get that information while Oklahoma sorts out the issues they're having with their website. So good luck, Jennie.
All right, our next one here, Matt, is from David. David said he met Matt at the NARO Convention in New Orleans, and he's got some mineral interest in his grandfather's name in various counties in Colorado. He's reached out to 3 different attorneys, and they've all quoted thousands of dollars to probate those interests. He receives about $125 a year across all 10 counties. So the choices have become to let the minerals go or try and work out going through probate himself. He's decided to try to go down that route of doing it himself. And he was asking about some document templates and kind of goes on to say about what the journey has been like. And so it appears that he tried to probate this estate in Lincoln County and then received a call a month later telling him that he should file ancillary probate. Back and forth, Matt. And unfortunately, this is all too common. You end up having to find the county in which the property was owned. And then really the estate has to be probated there to transfer the ownership. And if you have properties in several different counties, that can really become a very expensive ordeal.
Yeah, it can be very expensive. And that's the really tricky part with these interests that aren't generating any revenue. And so in his case, he's got mostly non-producing minerals in across 10 counties. There's a few that are producing, and he's getting about $125 a year, which is hardly enough to offset the cost of going through probate to get everything over into his name. And so this is I think the takeaway here, in addition to, like, if in David's case, he's willing to put the paperwork together to file a petition for determination of heirship. And so that is an option in Colorado, at least, rather than having to go through open probate in Arkansas in this case, and then coming back to Colorado and doing an ancillary probate there. Some cases you may be able to file a determination of heirship. And so, again, check with your attorney or an attorney licensed in the state where your interests are located to get specific advice. This shouldn't be construed as legal advice. I'm not an attorney, but in general, there's a couple different options sometimes to sort things out. But at the end of the day, though, it's going to cost money if you hire an attorney to do it, especially if there's, in this case, like multiple counties to have to go through. Ideally, if you're doing this once, to leave it for your kids so they don't have to go through this again. One option is to, if you go through and are able to get these interests transferred over, is to put them in a trust or a family LLC. And then you don't have to go through the probate process. And that can save a significant expense and headache for your heirs as well. And so this is something I think that's important to think about as, again, we always talk about interest as they get further divided up over time as they're handed down to, each generation and each kids, grandkids, et cetera. By the time you go through 3 or 4 generations, they're so small that it's hardly worth even getting it in your name. Basically, probate is going to be more expensive than any sort of value it ever derive from the mineral interest. So I think it's even more important now to think about within your family, if you're going to give these to your grandkids or to your kids, do it in a way that keeps them whole so that if they ever decided to sell, first of all, there'd be enough value there that they could, and or if they ever needed to lease, they would have bargaining power there instead of getting divided up into such a small interest that it becomes hardly worth the effort to manage. So I think that's the lesson here, but certainly there are ways to do some DIY paperwork there. You could do a kind of a hybrid approach in this case, maybe prepare the determination of heirship petition based on a template that you could find maybe, and then have all the supporting documentation in terms of death certificates, original mineral deeds of the record title holder, the foreign probate documents, if those are there, wills, all the things to demonstrate who the rightful heirs are. And then you could have an attorney review it as maybe a little bit of a more cost-effective way to get that prepared so that it's accurate when you go to file it. It's going to be accepted. It's going to achieve what you want to achieve. But then there are certainly filing fees that go along with these things, and it's not free to file that petition to get the courts to rule on that you're the rightful heir and it's yours, and then you can go ahead and transfer it over. But yeah, at that point, it's just a side project. If you have time, that's great, something to do. But otherwise, I've seen where people will let these things go. We had a conversation before we hit record about a couple of clients that I've worked with that were in the boat of just deciding to stop paying the property taxes and let it go to a tax lien sale just because there wasn't much value there and it wasn't worth them going through the probate process. They were paying the taxes on behalf of their parents that had never been deeded over to them. And it's just something that's tricky for sure. So.
Absolutely, Matt. And as we mentioned before with some of the other questions, as the interests get more fractionalized, so they get split up through the generations, this becomes even more difficult because the cost to pay a provider like Matt to evaluate a property is going up. And if the interest is getting smaller, it just can a lot of times not justify it. And David, another thing, if I was in your shoes, I would be calling the operators and asking them, what else will you accept other than going through probate? And just to see what they say. Some may stick it to you and say probate's the only one. It'll really depend on the state's laws and what the operator will accept. But that would be my first ask is please tell me there's something other than probate.
Yeah, that's a great catch. And I think that we've heard that before from other listeners that have been able to file an affidavit of heirship. Now, that doesn't perfect title. It's not, it's going to be contested. So it's not marketable title, clear title, but potentially to get paid royalties and to get it at least transferred over. And some operators, if it's a very small interest, are comfortable with the level of risk and will do that. Some won't. But yeah, it's a great point, Justin. I think that's always a good question. If it's a producing interest, is to call the operator, ask them what they need to put you in pay status. And then maybe you could be surprised. Maybe they don't need as much as you had anticipated. So that could be an option. But yeah, if you eventually want to get it over in your name, you're going to have to go through probate or determination of heirship, unfortunately. So, all right. Well, that's all we have time for this month, but continue to write in. If you have a question you want answered on the show, please email it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com, and we'll link to all the resources we talked about today in this episode in the show notes, which can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.